introduction, my name is Elle. I work for Linux Academy. We're a training platform, and I am our SALT instructor. And I guess I'll get started. So many of us start using SALT in different ways. Some of us are the people that are looking for the solution to our existing infrastructure, and we bring SALT into our servers from that very first bootstrap or package install. And then there are those of us that start working at a company that already has a SALT infrastructure. We check our file routes, and we see there's hundreds of formulas, and we wonder what we got ourselves into. Or some of us are just happening to look for something new to learn. But regardless of how we start using SALT, once we get our first few states and formulas written, and as people join our company and sadly leave, we kind of need to start to think about how we can write our SLS files so it's easy for people coming in to understand what's happening, and so everyone's on the same page. So we're going to kind of break this talk up into 3 sections, which is one, how we can set up our files so people coming in can start contributing with minimal hassle. We're also going to consider how we can add some features to our formulas that make it a little bit easier when we expand, when we have more than 5 servers and we suddenly have 500, and also ways we can kind of expect and present the inevitable mistakes that happen. So let's start with how we can provide a baseline, how we can make SALT palatable for everyone that comes into our company. So obviously, there's an obvious answer here, which is follow best practices, but that's not what this talk is about. SALT has an amazing talk on that later on today. Instead, we want to think about how we can document, but don't leave, I don't mean adding articles in Confluence or whatever. I mean how we can think about how we self-document, and not just the files, our SLS files themselves, but also what happens when we run a high state. So I'm actually going to go ahead and run a high state right now. And just to note, this is a small SALT environment, just so everything can run nice and quick. But if we scroll up and look at the first thing we see here, the IDs, the name declarations of our states that run. Well, if we look through some of these, most of them are pretty obvious. MySQL, MySQL, we can tell they're part of the MySQL formula. But if I go up a little bit further, we have an issue here where some of my formulas are named things like modgd. And if we look further, we can see that, yes, this is related to our PHP formula. But what if we're scanning through more than the small amount of formulas I have going here? We have hundreds of formulas. What if we have hundreds of formulas running? Well, we don't want an instance where we look at our ID and we think, well, what is this module for? Is it for PHP? Is it for Apache? Or if we have legacy Apache servers and new Nginx servers, if we have a doc root called, we have a name declaration called something like create website doc root, we're not going to be able to tell what formula that's involved in. So one of the things we want to think about when creating self-documenting formulas with self-documenting output is whether or not we can tell which formula our name declarations are associated with. But beyond that, we don't just want to limit ourselves, of course, to our self-documenting output. We also want to make sure all of our formulas are easy to read and easy to understand. And this isn't just adding a bunch of hashtag comments. After all, over-commenting can almost be just as bad as under-commenting. And that's because if you have a state called install Apache and it's a package.installed state, it's pretty easy to tell what that's already doing. On the other hand, in instances like when you're using command.runs, well, in contrast, sometimes it's a little bit hard to tell what those are actually happening, or what those are actually doing, rather. And my personal example for this is I have a state that uses the WP CLI for WordPress, and personally, I can never remember which state actually does what. So, I personally make sure that in that state, that's the wrong state, I'm sorry. So personally speaking, I make sure I keep my internal notes that this is what's downloading the initial WordPress files versus what's downloading the initial files into the WordPress doc root for the actual website. I also personally have a note that this formula is broken, but that's neither here nor there. And one final thing you do want to note when commenting is you can't just comment out Jinja with the traditional hashtag and then the Jinja comment. You do want to make sure it's a curly bracket and then the hash mark or the pound sign when commenting out Jinja. So finally, there's some stuff we can actually get a little active with. And when we're not just updating or looking at formulas, when we're creating new ones, we also want to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Everyone's writing the same kind of map.jinja file. And that's where things like Cookie Cutter, which is a templating solution, comes in. And Cookie Cutter allows us to create a skeleton of files and directories that we can build our formulas off of. And there's a more advanced version of what I'm going to show you on the SaltStack formula repos. But we're going to keep things nice and simple for now. So if I wanted to create a new formula right now, all I would have to do is run Cookie Cutter, and then this .formula template is where I have the file saved locally in my file roots. So it's going to ask me what formula I want to make, and I'll say firewall D. So then, if I list out my files, I can see I have a firewall D formula available in my file roots now. Well, let's go ahead and see what's in there. I already have a defaults.yaml file, and init.sls, a map.jinja, and some example pillar. And just to show, the map.jinja contains a skeleton of everything I include in my map.jinja. It pulls in that defaults.yaml, has an OS map, all of that's set up. And the process of creating a template like this is actually surprisingly easy with Cookie Cutter. If I take a look at that actual formula template directory that we built this off of, you'll see something familiar, this double curly bracket, cookiecutter.formula. Well, if you've used Jinja, you know that's how you pull in a variable. And this variable here happens to pull in that firewall D formula name that I input. And this is all taken from the cookiecutter.json file, which acts kind of similar almost to, say, a map.jinja file. And if we were to look at that, it's just a simple JSON file where you simply specify one of the variables you want and supply a default value. In my case, it's just test formula. Although I do want to note, when you do use Cookie Cutter or any other templating solution, if the way it's set up is similar to Jinja, then you do want to make sure that when you do anything involving Jinja, you make sure any of that Jinja is encased in, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, double curly brackets and then single quotes. Because if you don't do this, Cookie Cutter will try to read your Jinja for your actual state as Cookie Cutter and try to render it. So you do want to make sure you stay away from that. So, okay. We've gotten everyone on the same page, right? So how do we want to take our existing formulas and sort of expand them to work for more situations than what we initially create them for? Well, we want to start by looking at the details. And one of the details we want to consider is the first solution we think of isn't always the best. I'm going to say most of us learn when we start using Salt how to use file.manage for configuration files. But there's plenty of instances where options like file.serialize is better. File.serialize allows us to generate files based on data we provide, and this can be YAML data, this can be JSON, this could be Python config parser. There's more than that, there's a number of options. And can you think of any config files that are basic YAML that might benefit? Do you use Salt to send, say, beacon configurations or mine configurations to your Salt minions? That's just plain YAML. So instead of creating a state or a formula that has a files directory and all of your files underneath that, you can just use a file.serialize and feed in your data that way. And even further than that, oftentimes there are execution modules, such as the Apache module, that have configuration or that have functions available to create configurations. So if I were to look at my Apache formula and take a look at my vhost.sls, there's a function called apache.config file that generates the vhost configuration file for you. You don't have to have a file saved, and you don't even have to use file.serialize. There's already a specialized function available to us. And then, of course, taking this to another level, sometimes the solutions we need aren't even on Salt itself. So say we have a number of SSL certs that we need to rotate. Well, that's fine if we're using the GPG renderer with Salt when we have 10 of them. But what if we have to update 100 servers? That's a little bit tedious. So oftentimes, there are solutions that go well with Salt, such as Vault, for this example I provided, that people already have formulas set up for. There's a Vault formula on the SaltStack repositories that allows us an alternative and substantially easier solution to rotating those hundreds of SSL certs that doesn't involve us sitting at the command line and running GPG commands. But to get back to things we can sort of demonstrate now, we also want to consider options like defaults.yaml, which provides us some protection in the event we add a formula to a new server. And what defaults.yaml does is provide default values for both pillar and any of our Jinja mappings. So the frustrating thing about defaults.yaml is there's actually not a lot of documentation on this, or any that I could find. So I'm going to run through this really quick. So when you create a defaults file, all you really have to do is take a look at your existing pillar. And in my case, I pulled out the pillar that I have here. And I went ahead and added it to my defaults.yaml file, along with some default configuration data, such as the server and client package for Debian-based servers, because I happen to frequently use Debian-based servers. And once we have that defaults.yaml file, what we have to do is basically bring this into our map.jinja and get them to work together, so we have default settings that we can override. So let's take a look at that map.jinja. Now, if we look at the top of the file, the first thing we have to do is actually import that defaults.yaml file. And I just imported it as default_settings. And then we have what was originally my initial map.jinja file, this set OS map, which just includes Debian and Red Hat-based values and variables. But after you do that, all you have to do is add a do statement. And what this do statement does is it takes your default settings, that value I assigned to the defaults.yaml up above, and you take that OS map, which is the name of this, and you basically merge them together with this do statement so they work in conjunction. And then finally, you set that value MySQL that you can call in your other files when you add your map.jinja as you normally would. So for example, if I were to open up my init.sls, all I had to do is add the from MySQL/map.jinja and then import that MySQL variable that I defined at the end. And that will pull in both your default settings, both your default pillar data, and anything that overrides it. You mean the defaults.yaml? Any automatic default that you want to contain. For me, I have default pillar data, which we'll get to the enabled one a little later, but I have my default root name and password, which you shouldn't have a plain text password, but if I GPG render it and tear down the server, it doesn't work anymore. I also have default server and client values that are based on Debian, because the majority of the servers I use are Debian-based, so it's safe to assume if I add it to something, it's probably being added to a Debian-based server. But all of these get overridden once you provide an actual pillar file. It's kind of just a level of defense in the event you don't. Sorry, I lost my place. Although I do want to note, if you do this, make sure after you add your defaults.yaml, you do run it on your testing server and probably your production server with a test equals true initially, just to make sure all your variables are in order. So we're on the same page. We figured out some ways to expand our servers. Well, what else is there? Unfortunately, it's the crushing realization that even if we get our SLS files absolutely perfect, in a few days or a few weeks, we're probably going to hate them. And that's because no matter what you do or how perfect you get things update, things change, and things will go wrong. Salt has updates. Things have happened where the behavior of the defaults execution module or the Salt utils change. They just recently renamed their bootstrap script, which happened to break some things for me. And then, of course, there's also instances where Python gets updated. Things like iter items from Python 2 to items from Python 3. If you go back in most of the SaltStack formula repo, you can see that there are PRs that happened and were merged where those changes occurred. So even if the changes aren't formula breaking or you have time to fix them, sometimes things do get missed and you suddenly realize your high states are failing. Well, what can you do from that? Well, what can you do from there? Well, you want to make sure, keep things easy, go back to basics. Remember to check your event bus. If you're, if it's a high state that happened that you didn't manually run, if it's a scheduled high state, you can always view the job details using the jobs runner. And of course, if you suspect there might be breaking changes, always remember to use test equals true. I think it's very easy for people, especially if you're mostly writing and working on development or staging servers, to not always remember to use test equals true, because you want to see what it breaks when you're working on things. But you don't want to see what breaks when you're merging a PR to your production server. You don't want to find out that you accidentally merged the wrong firewall DPR and locked yourself out of everything. And of course, you also want to remember that Salt does have full root access to everything it manages, so you want to be careful there. And of course, there are also things we can do with our formulas to sort of protect ourselves from the inevitable mistakes that happen. And one of these is using formula toggles, and that was the enabled false in my defaults.yaml. And essentially what this does is, if I have, okay, let's actually take a look at my top.sls file first. So all of my minions right now have the MySQL formula on them. In contrast, if we take a look at my pillar roots, only minion 1 actually has MySQL pillar data. So what happens if I have enabled set to false in my defaults.yaml file and I try to high state MySQL on both of these minions? That's not how you spell high state. So on my initial minion 1 minion, the one that has pillar data, we can get this, we see the MySQL formulas running. We have all of these name declarations that have MySQL appended to them. In contrast, if we look at my minion 2 minion, well, we've got some PHP going on. Scroll down, oh. I'm sorry. Well, MySQL shouldn't be running. I might have to update my pillar data. I'm sorry. What? That was minion 2. What? I'm sorry about this. Oh. Actually, no, that was correct. I just forgot I added something to my defaults, or my init.sls file, like shortly before this. But if we check, we do have a MySQL response, but it's actually a test succeeded without changes that tells us the MySQL formula is disabled, supply pillar data. Sorry about that. I just added that because I thought it would be a good feature and then completely forgot about it. Don't update your talks like 5 minutes before, guys. So although we have a return from the MySQL formula, it's not actually doing any MySQL. And that's because in our default pillar data, we have that enabled set to false. So it tells us that, hey, you've added this formula to your minion, but you didn't actually finish the process. You didn't add your pillar data, which can save us a lot of heartache in the future, especially if it happens to be a minion that doesn't want to use your defaults on. And when you have this enabled equals false, all you need to do to set this up so it doesn't run is if I take a look at my init.sls, I just have this simple if statement, if MySQL.enabled, and that knows if that is false, not to run all of these includes that happens to be the majority of my MySQL formula. And this is the little else statement I added because I thought it would be nice and forgot about. But if it's false, it will output this MySQL formula disabled state that just sends me this little note that says the MySQL formula is disabled. Now what happens when we do add pillar data? Well, I'll open up my top.sls under my pillar file, and for minion 2, I'll go ahead and add that MySQL.web data. And then we can rerun that high state. And of course, it's working on minion 1 as it was before. But now when minion 2 returns, it's not that MySQL state disabled, it's all of the same it's all of the same MySQL states that were included in that if statement. And that's just because in that pillar data, it has an enabled true that overrides the defaults.yaml enabled false we provided. So these are some small but easy changes that we can make to sort of clean up our files and make sure everyone's on the same page as us. Not just other people, but ourselves in the future when we go back in a few weeks or a few months or a few years and we have to update an old formula. So even if you don't use every takeaway here, hopefully, even if you don't use every takeaway here, hopefully you kind of leave with the desire to consider how you have your formula set up and how the people around them can get in and adapt them easily. So that's all I've got. I spoke really fast. Thank you. Questions? So if anyone has questions, you can raise your hand, otherwise. That was 45 minutes when I practiced it. Oh, I'm sorry. It kind of depends on your use case. If it sort of provides a line of defense if you forget your pillar data. If you use a common certain type of server and you want to set the defaults to that, it's definitely not a mandatory thing. It's sort of an additional feature you can add that can help benefit and help out when you have hundreds of servers that might get a little confusing. I just have Vagrant because I wanted a small environment that could still work even if the internet didn't work. They warn us that you want to make sure you can do your talk even if horrible things happen. It seems like the best solution for me. Yeah, no, this is just to make sure that everything's functioning, worst case scenario. I mean, if that's it, you guys can get some time back. You don't have to sit here and stare.